Yo, what is up guys, Jack Gardiner here. I hope you enjoyed that little improvisation at the beginning there. I've tried to leave in all the mistakes. It's worth pointing out before we even start this video that you cannot expect to be perfect all the time with your improvisation. We just try and iron out these details as we go, essentially. But I want to point out, if you want that backing track, then that is available for free over at my website. And I must just get the sponsor out the way. Today, this video is sponsored by the courses and masterclasses over on my website. They are currently 25% off. So things like the Improvisation Roadmap Part 1, Part 2, even my brand new REHARMONISATION course. They are all 25% off using the discount code below. So if you enjoy this video and you want to look at some of these topics in more detail with some backing tracks, guitar profiles, tabs, etc., then definitely check out those lessons over at my site. Without further ado, I want this to be a bit of a roadmap in terms of how you should approach improvisation regardless of level. So whether we're a complete beginner or whether we're an advanced player, hopefully there are things that you can take away from this lesson. Let's get straight into then point number one, and that is regardless of whether you know any scales, say you have no knowledge at all of even a pentatonic scale, you can improvise on guitar. What are you on about there, Jack? Well, it brings me to the most important point, and that is the fact that for me, I think rhythmic value is way more important than any kind of melodic value. You might think, what are you on about? Well, for me, I think if the time feel and the understanding of rhythmic subdivisions is not there, it doesn't matter how advanced you are, how many scales, arpeggios, what you can do with substitutions and stuff like that. If your time feel is not good, then it's not going to sound musical, and any phrasing that you play is just going to sound weak or very amateurish. And that's the first thing I will point out, that even a beginner can do this. So this is a very simple exercise, but I'll take that backing track and all I'm going to do is either clap or sing rhythms over the top. So if I click play on this over here, all I have to do is think, there's my pulse. I can go tack a tack 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 sounds like random gobbledygook at the minute. But if I apply these same kind of ideas just to one note, let's say that B note on the 12th fret of the B string, then this should sound okay. You get the idea. And while that may sound silly at the moment because it's just one note, if I apply that to, say, a pentatonic scale, which we'll look at in more detail later on, then I could just rhythmically improvise using those notes. Because hopefully my time feel is strong enough and I have control over the subdivisions, this should start to sound like music straight away. Check out this, regardless of it being simple or complex. Let's give it a go. Super simple in terms of its context, but I hope you can hear there, a pentatonic scale can sound very, very musical. But this brings me on to point number two then, and I think this is what most people probably want to hear. I think point one, if you take anything from this video, is going to work and apply to whatever scale or arpeggios, whatever level you are at already. If that's the only thing you take away from this video, then I would say that's years worth of work if you want to actually give it a go. But point number two is all about finding a visualization method. Guitar, by its very nature, it's got a very strange tuning. It's a shape-based instrument. It's not like the keyboard or a piano. You know, we have multiple options of where we play each note, just with a C. We've got all of these different options, and if we land on different fingers, then that leads us into different territory in terms of what comes next. You know, where are we going to play the next 3 notes? It all depends on which finger we land on. So choosing a visualization method is going to be the most important thing, I would say. I've seen tons of guys come up with all crazy theories. I even had one student at one point, and forgive me for saying this if you're watching out there, but he'd come up with his own method of, like, you know, triangles, symbols to outline the fretboard, different color schemes, all this kind of stuff. And I had to tell him, like, man, it's way more simple than that. We cannot physically see the whole fretboard at one time. We have to look in little chunks. And of course, once you internalize it a bit more, you can move between these chunks, but it's not like we see the fretboard as this thing that lights up with all the frets that we need to play. No, it's all about the smaller information and relating things, I think, back to anchor points or root notes if we're doing a visualization method regarding intervals. But there are 3 main types of visualization. We have cage system, the 3-note per string way, and then we've got the intervallic way, which I think personally is the best. When I started off with guitar and visualization and improvisation, I wasn't really shown what to do other than that pentatonic scale, you know, box 1. Quickly figured out that there was 5 of them. And then that was kind of my reference point. I dabbled a tiny bit into cage, but I quickly found that frustrating. I did a little bit of 3-note per string, but I found that I wasn't doing anything really musical with it. I was just blasting up and down scales. There was no music within there for me. And I related to this thing of what people say when they feel like they're stuck in shapes. I think the way to break this is the intervallic way. Now, before you can do any kind of intervallic way, you do need to know your note names. Even if we scrap them later and only the root is important, you still need to be able to find the root of whatever chord you're playing over. And if you are struggling with note names, then one good way to learn these, I think, is if you know your 5-position pentatonics, to take this exercise. So I'm going to think I am in A minor and I'm going to play box 1. I'm going to look for that root note in that box. So I have one here, I have one here, and I have one here. Box 2, I have one here, and I have one here. Box 3, I have one here, and I have one here. Box 4, I have one here, and I have one here. Box 5, I have one here, I have one here, and I have one here. And then we're back to box 1. So only box 1 and box 5 have 3 of these, the rest have 2, and you can practice it like this. You can take that through all keys using the cycle of fourths. You know, if that was the case there, what I could think is I could go to D as my next one. I'm a little bit out of tune, the intonation's got a little bit, but you get the idea. The next one will be G kind of thing. I just want to solidify where those notes are. As guitar players, I think we tend to learn all the notes on the E and the A string because that relates to our chord voicings, you know, our power chords, even shell voicings, things like that. But really what we need to do is look at, can we see these roots on the D, G, B and high E string too? Another thing to bear in mind is that they can feel like you are locked in shape. So another exercise to kind of grow on that would be the idea that regardless if you play in box 1, I'd get you starting box 1 with a different finger. So finger 2, can you see them there? Finger 3, we're probably going to slide into position 5 there. But you could give yourself an example of like, can I see it here as well? Like this. If you are looking for a solid way of visualizing this stuff, then definitely check out my Fretboard Visualization course and Improv Roadmap Part 1. It's just going to help out massively. But yeah, that kind of covers point 2. What I would do then for point 3 is look at arguably the most important scale for guitar players when it comes to improvisation. And this is the pentatonic scale. You might think, why? I know I had a student come to me who was very young, Gen Z, and he was like, he just didn't know this scale. He could shred all kinds of other stuff, but I could see him struggling to get a minor pentatonic box 1. And he told me, I thought that this was only for boomers. Let me tell you, that is not the case at all. Every guitar player in the world, in that sense, would be a boomer if they're at a certain level, because everyone is using pentatonics at some point within their playing. And I think it's arguably the one scale that can make you sound very guitaristic, playing to our advantages. Not like a keyboard player. Keyboard players cannot necessarily do this in the same way. It just doesn't sound necessarily the same. You could argue they could use the pitch bend and stuff like that, but to phrase with all of these micro bends and stuff, I believe a lot of this phrasing comes from the blues and it comes from pentatonic scales or blues scales. So when it comes to learning the pentatonic scale, of course you learn your shape. But to take that one step further, what I would actually do is look at the intervals that create this sound. So if we're in E minor, just for the sake of it, because this track is in E minor or G major, we would think our root is going to be E. We have a flat third, we have the perfect fourth, we have the perfect fifth, we have the minor 7 or flat 7, and then it just repeats. Why is this important? Well, I think inside this scale, we have the minor 7 arpeggio, and we also have just a minor triad, something that is very important that we'll get onto later, but they are chord tones, and that is exactly how we outline certain chords. Another thing is that I see people jumping straight to scales all the time. Very often this leads to 3-note per string shapes. If you can't improvise with these 5 notes, I think you're going to have a very tough time improvising with 7. Forget about all of that stuff about it being for boomers and all that kind of thing. If you cannot do more with less here in this situation, then good luck doing it with more notes. At least that's what I feel with this. So when I'm looking at all of those notes within the scale, what am I doing? I am thinking of what they are in relation to that root note. So I see a third here. I see a fourth here. I see a fifth here. I see a flat 7 here. And then I see, of course, the octave. I could do it the other way. So I could go in the middle here. Here's another root. I see the flat 3 here. I see the perfect fourth there. I see the fifth here. I see the flat 7 here. And I see the root there. I could also see, the third here. I could see the third the other way in relation to this root. I could see the third in relation to this root below. And this is what I'm working on really in terms of getting the visualization there. I like to think of it both visually, but also what all of those intervals sound like. If you're wanting some ear training stuff, then I would definitely check out the website Toned Ear. It's free. It will just help you to kind of work on interval training every day. It's like a muscle. It's like going to the gym. The more you do this, the more it will all kind of solidify in your mind. But what I would say is just with that pentatonic, you should be able to phrase musically. And if you're stuck for ideas and you don't want to transcribe anyone else's playing, then you can just think rhythmically like I did earlier on there. It will work totally over the track. Okay. In level 4 then, or point number 4, I want to talk about how we would view this in terms of the opposite way. So a major pentatonic. So for me, what I like to do is I think E minor and G major contain the same notes. Rather than thinking of these as like, just the interchangeable thing, I want to take this one step further where I am able to see the intervals within this pattern, but in relation to that G root. So G is my new root note. I will think of this then as the major second. This is the major third. This is the fifth. This is the sixth. So our major pentatonic in terms of intervals is just 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. We've got that. So all of these notes that were there before that I was relating to E have changed function, and we need to look at that G as the root. And this is really, really important if you are wanting to outline chord changes. At least that's what I feel. I think this is just a great way of being able to translate vocab, but understanding it on a deeper level and understanding which intervals you are playing against the chord type. That kind of sums it up then for this point. Let's move on to the next one. How do I decide which pentatonic scale to play over the chords? Well, this is where it's really important to understand how diatonic harmony works. And for this example, we are going to look at this backing track. You first need to analyze what chords you are playing over. And in this track, in its most simple form, you could argue that it's like E minor 7, and then it's like a D over F sharp, a passing chord, to G major. Just think of it as that. You could think really simply E minor, then you've got D with an F sharp in the bass, and then G major, really. And that's telling me that it's coming from the key of either G major or E minor. You have to have a solid understanding of how to construct these scales and how to harmonize a scale and build chord structures, etc. If you are looking for how to do that, then check out either Improv Roadmap or my REHARMONISATION course, where we talk tons about this kind of stuff. But essentially, that's where I'm getting this idea from, that I can play E minor pentatonic or G major pentatonic over it, because all of these chords are part of that key. So once I learn that, I would take just simple areas of the fretboard. You don't need to know it all over the place at once. You should start trying to make music just in one small area of the fretboard and then move on, I would say. Limitation is your best friend in this case. So it brings me on to the next point, really, which would be point number 6. And this is the idea that you should be able to phrase in, say, let's just take the 5 positions of the pentatonic and make music with all of them within the limitation of each position. And I'm going to try and demonstrate that now over the backing track. Hopefully you can hear there, all of these can sound pretty musical, and we're just working within the limitations. Now, I could spend hours just in one position there and really get a feel for it. At the moment, I was just really thinking rhythmically, and the melodic choices were coming afterwards, I would say. But I'm still aware of what intervals I'm playing over the chords as they are moving. So as I was playing, over the majority of it was the kind of G major where it's a stab, and then over the E minor, I'm shifting my thinking of what intervals I'm playing. But I'm still within that one position. Now, of course, there are tons of exercises you can get from this. You can start mixing positions. You can go, I'm only going to play in position 1 and 4. You could say, I'm only going to play in position 2 and 5. You know, it's endless, but this is how we get creativity. And you can think of both like the note value, what intervals you're playing, but also you could think just rhythmically over the top to get creative. Now, the other thing I would say, and this is another point, is that you need to be transcribing. You need to be taking licks from other people. I've seen some people on the internet say, no, you don't want to do that. It's all about feel, man. Like, you know, just don't copy. And I think that is totally wrong. Every player, you can trace back their DNA. There will be ideas that they've transcribed, whether consciously or not. They have copied things that they've liked and then turned it into their own thing, creating their own voice. You know, all of the greats you'd see, even modern guys like Matteo Mancuso, you would be able to translate lines like that came or inspired from Frank Gambale or, you know, Alan Holdsworth. And I know this because I've spoken to Matteo about it. There's no two ways about this. To get better at improvisation, we need language. And that means transcribing and taking licks from other people before you even start to adapt them to your own. So I'd say that is a very, very important point. Don't neglect that. Regardless of you going through scale shapes and stuff like that, you need to be taking ideas. It can be as simple as one little lick, something like that. And you just work on that for a day, seeing how many different scenarios you can apply it to, how many different chords, how many different keys you can do it in, different places on the fretboard. So that one, what did I play? I could see how many different ways I can play this. I could do this kind of thing. All the different ways I can do that is going to be important. And this is just pentatonics that we're talking about at the moment. Let's move on to the next point then. So my next point would be something that a lot probably don't want to hear, but that is the execution. By this, I mean dynamics, vibrato, string bending, attack, pick attack. All of these things really are the kind of difference between, say, an intermediate and someone that sounds pro. So regardless of how little notes you are playing, I think these are things to be aware of all the time. If I was to take a good example of this, would be, say, an Andy Timmons song, one of my favorite players on the planet, one of the most expressive players I think out there. If I was to take his track, Electric Gypsy, and just take the note value of this, it sounds awful to my ears. It's all about how hard you attack the note. All the micro details, like the little slides there. The vibrato. Playing it with fingers instead of the pick. All of these things need to be taken into consideration. If we go back to just our basic pentatonic scale, this phrase, if I just play the notes, sounds kind of flat. Whereas if I experiment with the dynamics of it, some of them softer, some of them lighter, just slightly change the rhythm of it. I've got more vocab. Add vibrato. A different sound there. What about if I had some bendings? I have a different phrase. What about another slide? Slightly change one of the notes there. But it's this, I'm trying to rinse as much as I can out of this one phrase by just adding things like slides, vibrato, conscious of my pick attack, how's the volume on the guitar, which pickup am I on? All of these things are what arguably makes someone sound like themselves. It's their voice. And this is something that a lot of players tend to forget. We just want the note values or the rhythmic values, and we forget about all of these little, mini things that add up to the full picture or the full sound. So I'd say that is extremely, extremely important. If your vibrato is not working, then you need to fix that. If your bending is not intonated properly, you need to fix that. These are all things that, when it comes to improvisation, remember, there's no editing like you see in a lot of videos these days. This is stuff that you actually have to work on for years to get good. And that's a simple solution, I would say, to probably everything here, is that it takes time. Never forget that. It's never a quick hack or a quick fix. All of this takes years and years to kind of work into your own guitar playing. The next point is talking all about triads. And you might think, why aren't we doing full scales? Well, I would argue that triads, because they contain the chord tones, are arguably way more important than scales at this point. And if you don't know how to visualize triads on the guitar, then I have a whole free video on YouTube. I'll leave that down below that you can check out for some practice exercises and ways of seeing them. And if you want it in more detail, then of course, check out the Fretboard Visualisation course. But essentially, we should apply it to this track. Now, for the beginning side of this, I would only think of 2 of them. I would not care about that middle chord, that passing chord in between. So I just literally care about E minor and G major. And all I would do at first is see if I can see them within that pentatonic, because they're in there. If you think E minor, just within this box 1 shape, is here. G major is also in there too. I played an E in there. But I should be able to see where these are, because I know if I land on any of those notes as the chord is being heard, that it's going to sound good no matter what, because it's part of the chord itself. So what I would do is, before you learn it all over the fretboard, I would say, can you just do it in that one position where we are just focusing really simply, like... Where there, I'm just taking 4 notes at a time for each one and seeing, can I see the arpeggio shape within? Once you've done that, you could do it through each position. But I would say then, when you can see the triads everywhere, you can experiment with just improvising with those notes over the chord. So E minor triads when there's an E minor chord, and G major triads when there's a G major chord. I will just think rhythmically for now, but of course you should be aware of what all of these notes are sounding like too, so that you can make musical decisions of what you like over the chord. Let's give this a go. I'll try and demonstrate this over the backing track, so I'm just literally limiting myself to E minor and G major triads here. Now, you might be thinking, this actually sounds a little bit rubbish, and it probably does at the minute, but it's still so important to be able to see where these are, and just little fragments of these can really outline the sounds of the chord really nicely. If you mix this with, say, like the minor pentatonic, you just use a small fragment of an arpeggio, you get some nice movement. There, I was just thinking of a G major within pentatonic box 4. You know, the pentatonic box would be. What really opened up triads for me, and guitar in general with improvisation, was realizing that I can take any of the triads from within the diatonic key and they will give me different flavors. So by that, what I mean is I harmonize the G major scale, and we get this like G major, A minor, we've got B minor, we've got C major, D major, E minor, this F sharp diminished if it's just a triad, and then back to G. And I can pick different ones of these to give me different flavors. You know, if I looked at the one built from the 5th of G, then we're taking a D major arpeggio. Why does that sound cool? Well, essentially over the G, we need to look at all of these notes in relation to that G root. You've got the 5th, you've got the major 7, you've got the 9th, and then you've got the 5th again. You relate this to the E minor, what do you get? Then you've got the flat 7, you've got the 9th, you've got the 11th, and then you're back to the flat 7. So that's adding in color tones or extensions at the top there, I should say. Something we'll get onto a little bit later on. But let's try. I mean, I'm going to use any of these from within the harmonized sound and just try and create some lines based off of them. You know, this ties in a lot to a concept I love to use, triad pairs. This is covered in Improv Roadmap Part 2. It's a huge thing for me when it comes to improvisation. Without further ado, let's check out how this sounds then over the track. From here, what I would actually do then is look at 7th arpeggios. Now, this is kind of simple. We just add an extra note on top of our triad, building from that stacked thirds kind of thing. I'd harmonize the scale the same way. You know, you get G major 7. You could get A minor 7. B minor 7. C major 7 if it's in G major. D7, dominant 7. E minor 7. F sharp, minor 7 flat 5. And back to G major 7. And I mean, these are essentially outlining loads of different colours. I go really in depth with this in Improv Roadmap Part 2, but I would say that this is probably the main thing that's going through my head the whole time whenever I'm improvising over a chord structure. If I'm looking at diatonic harmony, I'll be thinking of all of these and what different colours they imply. Depending on which kind of, modal thing I want to outline as well. We'll get onto that when we talk about scales. But I think this is kind of the fundamental, understanding what colours these all add individually and trying to create lines with them. So let me give you another quick example. This time I'll use some 7th arpeggios. See if you can spot which ones I'm picking out. Hopefully you can hear there all of the kind of colours that this adds. By playing these 7th arpeggios or superimposing them over the chords, we're getting all of the extensions, which is really, really cool. Take, for example, that B minor 7, if we're viewing it as E as the root, then we've got the 5th, we've got the flat 7, we've got the 9th, and we've got the 11th. So it's kind of like playing an E minor 11 chord here. We view it as G as the root. Then we've got the 3rd, major 3rd. We've got the 5th. We've got the 9th. Major 7th, and then the 9th on the top, I should say. Which just gives us like a beautiful G major 9 chord. And we're not learning them in the sense of like, here's an E minor 9 arpeggio, where you go. There's nothing wrong with learning it that way, but if you just want quick access to that sound, then this is through the use of superimposing 7th arpeggios. Like I say, that is all in Improv Roadmap Part 2. If you are interested in that kind of sound, I go really in detail, tons of lick examples and things like this. But yes, this brings me on to kind of the final point for now, really, and this is where we get to scales. And you might think, how has it taken us so long to get here? And I would say that all of the other things are actually probably more where I'm thinking of rather than the scale when I am improvising. And for me, when I'm looking at scales, I think in two different ways. If I'm thinking modally and we've got like a 1 chord vamp, then I can think of one mode. Whereas if I'm playing chord changes, the 9 times out of 10, the scale comes secondary. I'm really focused on nailing the chord tones as the chords change. It's like the scales are the little filler bits that get added in around that. The way in which I'd learn scales, if you're in a 1 chord situation and we have like these islands, imagine we're just moving, say, E minor 7 and then to, say, a non-diatonic thing like, let's go to E flat minor 7. Then I would think of them as like 2 separate islands and I have the scale, if I have time, so long as those changes aren't quick. Whereas if I'm thinking of, playing over diatonic chord changes, I might think of a 1 scale fits all situation, but I'm trying to outline the different chord tones really as each chord comes, shall we say. I hope that all makes sense. But really, when it comes to identifying the scale for the chord, I think in terms of the chord scale theory. So if I'm thinking of like a minor 7, I tend to actually think of Dorian first. The way in which I build these is by building from a pentatonic, taking all the vocab there, using hexatonics or what some call like the pentatonic plus system, then all the way to full scales. And through that limitation, I get the most out of the scale and I don't just sound like a 3-note per string shred machine. This kind of thing. I played a mix of Dorian and Aeolian there. But I would say if you are interested in learning that kind of approach, then Improv Roadmap Part 1 is the way to go, where I talk about all the different chord types and how I would approach each one in terms of building scales or building towards scales, really, with tons of lick examples and solo examples. But for now, I would say if we're in this key of, E minor or G major, then the G major scale is obviously going to work, or E minor scale is obviously going to work. But there are some notes in there that I would tend to avoid. One of them being this C note over both chords. I mean, when it's over the E minor 7, it's a flat 6 interval. And when it's over the G major, it's a 4th or 11th. And typically they don't sound the greatest over this kind of progression. You can use it in passing. There is no reason why you cannot build a phrase where this note worked as a passing note, but I'm not sitting on it. I'm not doing this. That sounds just a bit weird. Or maybe it can kind of work, but if there's a major 7th chord in there, we have a huge clash. There's a tritone interval in between some of them in there. So that's where, I would say get used to playing with this natural minor or, natural major scale in one area of the fretboard maybe at first. Take that pentatonic and just think, can I see the scale within that? So see if I can phrase using the pentatonic as the framework and let's see as a passing note. But the one note which I really do want to consider is this 9th of E minor or major 7th of G. That sounds really cool and it just adds another level of sophistication. So what I'm going to do now is just give you an example of how I would use like a limitation exercise of just one area of the fretboard using that scale. I'm going to avoid the flat 6 a lot of the time, but I am going to try and land on that 9th if we're thinking E minor, of course. In G, like I say, that would be the 11th that I would kind of avoid, or the 4th. But I would kind of target the major 7 as part of this. So let's hear this example over the backing track. Hopefully you can hear there are quite a few musical ideas just via that limitation of staying in that one area of the fretboard. But I'd do that all over the neck, and then I'd see if I can actually connect ideas. In terms of how I view scales, like I say, in Improv Roadmap Part 1, I talk a lot about limitations and hexatonics, pentatonic plus, all that kind of stuff. And in my Fretboard Visualisation course, I actually look at different ways you can view it in terms of the interval way, in smaller limitations, really, so that you're never getting stuck, regardless of which fingers you land on, which tends to be the biggest issue, I would say, with a lot of guitar players when it comes to improv. We're very used to certain fingerings and certain shapes. We want to kind of break that. But anyway, the next thing I want to talk about then is how we can imply different scale sounds, really. So these 3 chords, that E minor 7, the D over F sharp, and the G, could actually belong to a different mode. And I already mentioned this before. I could think of this as Dorian. But what I would do is take everything that we've done before, as in like the triads, the 7th chords, all that kind of stuff, and harmonize then this Dorian scale. Some people could say you're just thinking of it coming from like the key of D major, but really I want to remember what each kind of arpeggio on each different interval gives me in terms of color sound. So I can get this kind of stuff: E minor 7, F sharp minor 7, G major 7, A dominant 7, B minor 7, C sharp minor 7 flat 5, D major 7, E minor 7. I could have done that with triads too. I could do all the limitation things. I mean, let's just hear then what the Dorian mode will sound like. Remember, the Dorian mode has like a major 6 instead of flat 6. What does this sound like in terms of color over that backing track? Let's give it a little listen. Hopefully you can hear that the Dorian sound just gives a completely different flavor over this track, you know, especially with using those different arpeggios to outline that sound, really. Different extensions that we get, especially with that like natural 6 over the E minor, or you can think of it as, you know, like the sharp 11 over the G. It's just very, very different. You know, it gives a G Lydian sound almost. What I would say then is that from here, where do we go? Now that would be where we start looking at more advanced concepts, things like chromaticism, you know, outside sounds. Maybe we could look at like melodic minor. I've just dropped a pick again. Or we could look at, you know, like implying secondary dominance, you know, taking a B7 over the top of this, some diminished ideas as well, or arpeggios. There's tons that we can do, but I would say what needs to stick as a constant throughout all of that is that you need to take all of these fundamentals and build on it from there. Limitation, little bits of vocab. It's years and years of work. It's not just like, oh yeah, there's the scale, off you go, now you can improvise with it. No, it can take 5 years before you feel comfortable with a certain scale sound all over the fretboard in every key, you know, or over different chord structures, things like that. Never forget that this is a lifelong journey and you never complete it with improvisation. It's not like a technical exercise where you're like, right, I can do that, now I'm done. No, it takes a very, very long time. Now, the one thing I didn't talk about throughout this was about technique. And I am a firm believer that technique is just like adding more tools to your belt. It's not a bad thing to have more technique at all. Just having more facility just means that you can play more complex lines and execute them better. So never ever let anyone say, oh no, you don't need to worry about technique, you know, just play with feel. Ignore that rubbish. Technique is just however far you want to go with it in order to facilitate what you want to play. But if you are interested in that kind of stuff, I definitely have lick packages as well. There's like 25 Aeolian licks. There's even an old one, 25 Dorian licks, to give you some ideas of how you can incorporate some of these ideas, but in more of like a technical way too. Yeah, what shall we do? I mean, I think to round this off, I'll give you a nice little example of some outside sounds maybe over the top of this, where I'll use some of those things that I mentioned, like melodic minor and some secondary dominance. And like I say, if you want to check out any of these in way more depth with tabs, backing tracks, solos, all that kind of stuff, then it is currently 25% off over at my website. Check out the links down below. So maybe that was a bit extreme, but I hope you get the idea. I'm using that idea of, you know, rhythmic kind of confidence. I'm using the idea of arpeggios, triads, all of these things, merging them into one to get some of those outside sounds by chromaticism or just plain outright outside scales. I hope this all kind of makes sense and that you've taken away something from this lesson. Don't forget, like I say, there is currently 25% off at my website on all of my courses using the coupon code below. And of course, you can get that backing track for free over there too if you want to try out some of these ideas for yourself in your own playing. My name is Jack Gardiner. I hope you'd enjoyed this mini little masterclass or roadmap, whatever you want to call it. Till next time, cheers.